John from Ripewave Audio to tell you about the newly introduced Marantz AV20 AV processor. Now, of course, this comes with also the introduction of the AMP20. We're only going to touch upon the AMP. We're going to focus mainly on the processor and why this is being introduced at a price of $6,000 and where it fits into the range and why you might want to jump up from one product or another. Now, we recently did a video on the AVR A10H, which filled in the Denon range. It sat just below the A1H flagship AV receiver. Now, Denon is focused on receivers. They kind of made the decision after the 6800 they'll continue with all-in-one boxes versus Marantz is taking a different strategy after the Cinema 30. But yes, the A10H replaced the X8500HA, and we did the video on that. So if you missed that, take a look. But as far as the AV20, now we kind of anticipated this. We had a video that came out July 20th of last year, and we said, we're waiting Marantz for the AV20 replacement, or whatever is going to replace the AV7706 and the AV8805A. And we weren't quite sure which one it would be first. Is it going to be more closely resembling a Cinema 30 and its price point, or closer to the AV10 and its high price of $7,000? And also that 8805 lived around that. And I think we were pretty close in our predictions. I went back and looked at that 8-minute video, and yeah, we seem to be pretty close, and even getting the name right of AV20. Maybe it wasn't such hard a guess, but this table here shows the prior generation that ran from 2020 to 2022 and all the things in its lineup. Now, just about everything has been archived off, except you can still buy an AV8805A for $5,500 or an AV7706 for $3,200. So they still exist in the portfolio. I suspect the 8805 will be archived as soon as they probably sell off as much of the inventory as possible, because the AV20 is here now to take its place. Now about $500 more, but you are getting some more capabilities over that older unit that was introduced in 2021. So here, 4 years later, of course, inflation and etc., getting a couple more channels of processing. We'll go over the differences as we go through this. Now, the one product that still doesn't have a companion in the new generation that started in 2022 is that AV7706 AV processor, that 13-channel unit. That's what I'd like to see, because I thought, well, you know, the Marantz could either make something in that price range or closer to the $5,000 to $6,000 range in that, you know, we're waiting video last year. Now it turned out to be that $6,000 price, you know, something to fill in the gap between the Cinema 30 and the AV10 and take the place of 8805. But we didn't get that unit at the price point of the 7706. So we're waiting now on that. If we take a look at the comparison against Denon's product line here, we can clearly see that for their flagships, they've gone receivers. Marantz's strategy is processor separates. They said, Denon, you own that high count receiver market, we'll own the processor market, and there's some extra differentiation between the brands. Now, we had the Cinema 30 in. We thought that was a wonderful AV receiver. In fact, I thought that was one of the closer units to our Emotiva RMC1 as far as sound quality. Of course, they have some different feature sets between what's in the RMC1 and, of course, the Marantz supporting all the formats. And this AV20 is going to be no different as we get into this video. The Cinema 40 and 50 were introduced really first in this whole new series. I got the Cinema 50. As soon as it was announced, I put my name on the list for pre-order, and I did get that unit in, one of the first ones that shipped in the United States. Of course, the Denon had their equivalents. Now, we brought in everything between the Denon Marantz Cinema 50 on up to the Cinema 30, and you could hear a clear difference between each of these models. We'll go over that a little bit more later, and we can speculate what the AV20 might be bringing given some of the enhancement it has. But here is a look at the AV20. The 17-channel unit has balanced outputs for the pre-outs as well as unbalanced. So you get that XLR connection, which we don't see on the receiver units from either Denon or Marantz for pre-outs. So if you want that balanced connection, you do have to move up to one of these processor separates. Now we see the same remote as we've been seeing in other products coming out from Marantz since this new series began. But this is the newest one, and we can see that they did manage to fit in a component and composite connections for that legacy connection, which you didn't have on the AV10. Opening up the door in the front, we see those extra displays and the extra buttons for that convenience. If you don't have your remote handy and you're on your equipment rack and you need to make some quick setup changes and you don't have your television turned on or your computer with the web browser, you have yet another way to make some settings or some real-time adjustments to your listening mode. And we can see on the back of this a quite dense set of I/O on the back of this. It has that copper color because of the copper shielding that this unit possesses like the Cinema 30 does. Now what we like to do on these overview videos is show a comparison against the prior generation, and here we have the AV8805 processor setup. Now that A denoted it was an 8K unit like this new AV20, but the board didn't have quite the same capabilities with that upgrade that they did mid-cycle on the 8805. $5,500 unit, this is $500 more. You don't have now that LCD display on the remote. They've taken that off. I think they found that going to other methods like either the on-screen display or the web interface is the way they wanted to go, and maybe they wanted to save some cost as well. Now what you get on the AV20 that you didn't see on the prior generations is the metal part, the aluminum front. On the 8805 was really the center section, and that's what we have on our Cinema 50 as well, that center section being aluminum, but the sides of the front panel being plastic, and that's the case on the 8805A. But with the AV20, you have that metallic sides as they were introduced in the Cinema 30 as well, and anything below that was plastic. We can open up the door and we see some similarities here. The phono jack is hidden behind the door on the older unit. You do lose some of the convenient items of having an HDMI input on the front and that front aux video and audio input that was on the older units. Now everything is tucked away on the back. Flipping these around the back, you do see that the new unit has 2 additional subwoofers. This is what they're doing with the new series, going to 4 independent subwoofers versus 2. Now there's an amp control connection point, and we'll talk about that. That amp control is when it's married with one of the newer amplifiers, the amp 10, the amp 20. You can control the side lightings that's present all in coordination. So if you turn it off on one, they all go off together, or you're dimming, your brightness, your color choice all move together. And that's what that amp control, this is what you'll see on these processor separates that's designed to work with the Marantz amp 10 and amp 20. That's that amp control. There's an additional trigger output on this unit that you don't see on the 8805 for a total of 3. And you do lose some of the component composite I/O, so you're just down to 1 of the component and 2 of the composite. And you don't have a dedicated analog tuner input. It's just a generically labeled analog. Of course, you could plug in an external tuner if you happen to be one of those rare people that still have an external tuner. But I'll note that the 8805 had to have an external tuner because there was nothing built in. We'll see that on the comparison tables. Now let's compare it against the Denon closest equivalent. I say closest equivalent because it's a receiver, the A10H. Also has 17 channels of processing, but that addition of the 150 watts per channel into 2 channels driven are not present because this is a processor separate. Of course, Denon has its own look and feel. It's all that brushed aluminum on the front with a door that opens, as we can see here. A lot of the same button choices, although Denon has a little different. There's a quick select input buttons on the Denon, which you don't have on the Marantz. The remotes are a little different as well. Now you flip around this back and you see that the Denon is lacking that copper color because they don't do the shielding in the same way. And they're always positioning Marantz to have something a little more high quality as far as componentry or chassis design, etc. A little more robustness. And whether you can hear that difference, perhaps you can. I do hear a sonic difference between the Denon and Marantz. I typically prefer, and in fact, typically, in all cases, I've really found the Marantz to sound better to my liking, but there are those who prefer the Denon sound, which tends to be more aligned with, let's say, what you'd have in a mixing room versus the Marantz is more designed for more like a live performance. That's one analogy I have heard, but I do prefer that Marantz sound a little more than the Denon. Comparing the AV20 against the Cinema 30. This is one model down from the AV20, and it becomes a receiver at that point. Now, as I said before, I really like the Cinema 30. I would be perfectly happy with the Cinema 30, its sound quality, but if this thing can do even better, and maybe even better than my RMC 1, which I thought was better, slightly better than the Cinema 30, maybe it's worth that $1,500 more. If it's just a little bit, paying $1,500 to get that little bit, you have to make a decision because they're both 17 channel units. Now, albeit the AV20 is all balanced versus the Cinema 30, unbalanced connections, that 11 by 140 watt into 2 channels driven amplifiers built into the Cinema 30. You're not going to have those. Everything has to be externally powered with the AV20. So you have the amplifier difference for sure. You open up the door and they look exactly the same. I think the buttons are exactly the same, all the display and everything. The side pieces are still that same metallic versus plastic on these two units. And you do have the illuminated sides. You can control the color and the brightness, which I don't have on my Cinema 50 that's here. I don't have those color sides. And I was looking for it when I first got it. I was like, oh, okay, I confirm. They didn't put it on that model. They put it on the Cinema 40 on up. The remotes are the same, and we flip it around the back. Looks similar, but then you look at the speaker terminals in the Cinema 30 versus the balanced outputs, and that's the huge difference. But you also have the balance on the subwoofers. I wish they would put balanced outputs on some of their receivers because some of your subwoofers may be across on the other side of the room, and I think that's a good place to have a balanced connection because it's sometimes located a distance away from the receiver or the processor. Because the Cinema 30 isn't going to have that amp control because it wasn't designed explicitly to work with the amp 10 or 20, but it could work with those. Just not without that amp control that would control the lights on the side. Comparing one up on the model against the AV10, this looks exactly the same from the front except for that little decal that says it's an AV20 and not an AV10. Otherwise, completely the same, including the remote. And you open up the door, and yet again, no changes between the AV10 and the AV20. Where you're going to see the differences is when you flip this around and you see those 2 additional channels for an extra row of heights or whatever way you want to use those extra 2 inputs, which brings it to 19 channels of processing versus 17. Now it's still 4 independent subwoofers, so that count comes from either the ear level speakers or your height speakers, where you want to position those extra inputs, maybe even using it for bi-amping type of arrangement. This unit was released a couple years earlier in 2023 and is $1,000 more than the newly introduced AV20 that sells for $6,000. Still has that copper shielding that we see on both of these models, as well as the Cinema 30. Now let's look inside of this. Comparing the AV10 against the AV20, we see a deeper chassis, right? You got a couple more inches sticking out the back there, and you won't always be able to accommodate that depth. And so for those who are constrained on the space, maybe the AV20 is what they're going to have to use to fit in their space, or go to a different manufacturer. Now you look at this and they look like they're designed at the same caliber, right? You see that copper inside of it. You see the toroidal power supply. You see big capacitors on the power supply. You see a whole row of HDAM boards across the middle. You see a very similar HDMI board with heat sinks on it across the back. It looks very similar, and that big plate that says HEOS. Now what they say they've done with the AV10 is they've laid this out for the most optimal positioning where it's going to give you the best signal paths between the units, and not really being so conservative about how deep this is. Versus the AV20, particularly you can see on the power supply modules that they've turned them 90 degrees, and then it could make it a little shorter. So I've done things like that. Looking at the Marantz release video on this, they talked about other things like an enhanced HDAM. Similar design with their discrete circuitry, proprietary design versus taking an off-the-shelf op amps, and one for each channel. That same philosophy is there, but they've put a little extra quality into those HDAM modules. We'll show you that in a second. The resistors, moving to a MELF thin film resistor. The toroidal power supply is the same, no change there, but you do have larger capacitors in the power supply. The HDAM boards are 4-layer versus 2, and it's a more rigid chassis, and there's an improved phono preamp section. Now, if you really care about phono, you might have that external anyways, but you do get a little better one in the AV10. So this is what you get for an extra $1,000. It's not just the 2 channels. And everybody thinks about the 2 channels first, but there's also this circuitry enhancement, which could potentially result in a better sonic experience. I'd love to hear that difference myself. So here's some pictures that I grabbed from Marantz's presentation. You can see here they both have the SA3 version of their HDAM boards, but the AV10 they've mounted on those larger capacitors and those MELF thin film resistors versus the standard thin film resistor on the AV20 version of the same board. Again, these could be very subtle differences in improvements, but it's a circuitry improvement nevertheless. And you can also see the multi-layered board design change. So on the 4 layers for the AV10, they have 1 layer for the signal path, 1 for the power supply, 1 for the ground, and another one for signal. Versus the AV20, they have 1 layer that shares the signal and the ground, and another layer shares signal, power supply, and ground. So the 2 signals are the left channel, the right channel, for example. And you can see here different variations of the HDAM board, and they've been enhancing this as they've gone along. The 8805A had a different board, the 7706 had a different board. So all 4 of these products had different HDAM boards, but all discrete, all proprietary designs, all kind of based off the same type of formula that they do for their products. And you can see they have different layers. The AV10's the only 4-layer one out there. Here's a slide that they had showing the rigidity being improved on the AV10. So some extra layers being placed on the AV10 versus the AV20, but similar. Here is a comparison of the AV20 versus the AV30. So as I said, the AV30 sounds really good, and to me it might be good enough. But you can see there is some differences in the circuitry. Does this AV20 really take it up to that next level, warranting the extra $1,500 in cost? And that's for you to decide, and I think I'm going to be weighing that decision myself. But you can see the difference here. Pretty much the same size chassis between the 2, but different components laid out a little differently. And then here's the differences between the HDAM boards between a Cinema 30 and AV20. We showed you the AV20 before, but now you can see every channel because they have to fit that receiver all into a smaller compact chassis. With amplifiers, they had to put all the channels on one board versus separate boards for each channel. So it definitely a lot more goes into the AV20 because they're separating this all out. And here's comparing the AV20 against the Denon closest equivalent, their receiver, the A10H, both 17 channel units. And you can see the Denon's laid out differently. It doesn't have the HDMI technology. That's exclusive to Marantz. And then here's just AV10 against the A10H just for another comparison. And then here are all the units side by side to kind of give you a glimpse of where this sits. So the AV10, AV20, certainly the most robust units out there. Now, as I said, I'll talk about the AMP10 and the AMP20 just very quickly. So AMP10 was introduced with the AV10 a couple of years ago in 2023 at the same price as its processor, $7,000, has 16 channels of amplification. It's using modules, stereo modules that will give you 200 watts per channel into 2 channels at 0.05%. They can do that 5 channels driven, but they're measuring at 0.7%. Now, they say they don't play games, but I think that's a little bit of a game when they start measuring the distortion differently at the all channel. They're better than some. If you take that stereo module and run it in a BTL mode, so it combines it into one channel, you get 400 watts at 0.05%. These are using Class D modules, and they license the technology and they design and develop that in their own factory. They produce the actual amplifier modules. They don't buy them from somebody else, but they license the design. Similarly, the AMP20 uses those same Class D modules, but only gives it to you for 12 channels. Same power rating and everything, just less channels. And we can see on the back here, right? So just down to 12 channels from 16. So they've dropped it 4 channels. They can use an AMP10 with an AV20. And you can see they're not modular from the standpoint you can't add extra, like an Emotiva, you can have extra slots and put extra modules in. These chassis are designed for the channels that it was sold to have, and you can't add or subtract from there. And here's what they look together paired with their respective parent processor, but of course you can mix and match. Now let's get into the details for the Marantz line, throwing in a couple of Denons for comparison's sake here. And what I've done is carve this out into sections. So you have a 7.4 grouping of products. That's your Cinema 50, Cinema 40, and the AV7706. So that's going to give you 7 ear levels and 4 height channels on those 3 products. And depending on which generation, the old generation gives you 2 subwoofer channels and the new generation gives you 4. Moving up to the next grouping, you have the AV20, with this what we're looking at today, the Denon A10H, the AV8805A, and the Cinema 30 will either do a 7.6, that's 7 ear level, 3 rows of heights, or a 9.4, 9 ear levels, including the front wides, and 2 rows of heights on that choice. So the only models is that the older 8805 is only 2 subwoofers. So everything else is 17 channels. And then when you're getting into the flagships of each brand, it's 7.8 or 9.6, 7 ear level, up to 8 heights, or 9 with the front wides and 3 rows of heights for the Denon AVR A1H and the AV10. So those are the 3 groupings of your speaker layouts. And you should think about your speaker layouts, either what you have today or where you're planning to go. And you should target at least those that are capable of handling the layout you need. And if you get something with more, that might just be done only for sound quality reasons. Now, what we see is every single product in here will do Dolby Atmos and DTS:X. DTS:X Pro is only available from the Cinema 30 on up, because it doesn't have enough channel count on the Cinema 50, 40, and 7706. So you have Pro on up there. You also will have 360 reality audio in all of these, as well as Aural 3D. Now your Aural 3D capability and number of layouts will depend on number of channels you have, up to a 13.1 capability starting with the Cinema 30. Now they all have a 1/4-inch phono jack, an FM AM tuner, except for the 8805. That's why it had that tuner dedicated input. IEC removable power cord, and it has a factory power. So you have to either buy these as 115 or 220 volt from the factory. Now, if we look at the sound formats further, we've got IMAX Enhance on all of them, as well as Dolby Vision. They all come with Odyssey calibration by default with a microphone at no extra charge. These all listed here that support 4 channels of subwoofer output, so all the newer models, also support Dirac Live as a paid option. And you can also get Dirac Live bass control for all of the newer models as well. They've combined it now into one pricing model. What they've announced is coming soon is support for Dirac acoustic room treatment art. Now this has been available only with Storm up until this moment. They had an exclusive, started back a couple of years ago. Now it's finally being rolled out to Denon and Marantz. My understanding is that requires a lot of processing power, and I wasn't sure that something like my Cinema 50 was going to support that. Maybe it was only going to be available on the AV10 and 20, but they came out and said anything that supports 4 subwoofer outputs, meaning their latest generation products from either Denon and Marantz, this will become available, of course, for a paid upgrade license, which you get directly from Dirac. And that will be able to purchase just like any other upgrade license from Dirac, whether that be bass control or the Live. Now, you do have to have Dirac Live, either one of the 2 variants there, the bass control, before you can add art. So you can be in for your Dirac licenses for quite a bit of money by the time you get done with this. But with each upgrade, you get some improvement, and what the art is going to do is really make all your subwoofers work well together and constantly keep those adjusted. More on that in the future. Let's talk about the digital to analog converters. In the flagship units, the AV10, the AV20, as well as the Denon A10H, and we believe the A10H has an ESS ES9018 K2M chip on it. Now, the higher counts have 10 channels, and the lower count processor has 9 of these chips in them. So the AV20 has 9. Good signal to noise, THD from the chip itself. But what you really want to be concerned about is the processor. Now, all these flagship processors support from the A10H up 110 dB signal to noise output, a total harmonic distortion of 0.002%. They support PCM 24192 for every model and DSD 128. And as you go into units below this, like the Cinema 30, for example, has a ESS 9017S chip, has 2 of those 8-channel chips. It isn't as capable as what's in these higher models, and it will only do 104 dB output at 0.004%. But and then the 50 and the 40 go down from there as well. They share that Texas Instrument chip, which is a PC 5102A. There's 7 of those 2-channel chips. Looking at the I/O, all these have 7 inputs and 3 outputs on the HDMI, except for the Cinema 50, which is down to 6. 2 coax, 2 Toslink optical connections, no output on the digital side of the audio connectors, no AES EBU. We do have multi-channel pre-outs balanced for the AV10 and the AV20. Now the Denon A10H does have the 4 subwoofer as balanced. So you get that there, and the 8805 had 15.2 balanced outputs. And everything else is doing unbalanced, including these units. You have your choice, of course. And then you have balanced inputs, which is what we don't see on any other unit, except for these high-end flagships, as well as the AV20 that has one balanced input. So I could put my external phono preamp that has balanced outputs across the room and send it back to the AV20, as well as the AV10 and the Denon A10H that have that. Now, I don't believe the A10H has that balanced input. You do have 6 analog stereo inputs, RCA connections, versus you get into those flagships, they start to take 1 or 2 away from that count because it's just so dense with those outputs. They all have 2 zone outputs, except for the Cinema 50 that has 1. And then we talked about the composite, the AV20, having 2 of the composite and 1 of the component video. They all have a moving magnet phono input, and as we said, the AV10 is a little better moving magnet preamp in that unit. Looking at the video a little more closely, 8K capabilities. This is 2.1 feature sets that are in that. They're going to give you 7 in, 2 out. One of your outputs is limited to 4K on that, but they all have eARC. They're all going to do 4K 120, 8K 60, variable refresh rate, quick frame transport, auto low latency in that capability. Now, QMS is one of those things that Marantz was advertising, as well as Denon as supporting it, and then they took it away. I think what happened was, if we look on the slide here, that there was a chip error that Nuvoton, which was the former Panasonic manufacturer of these chips, is an incompatibility on the QMS, and they're not going to resolve this, maybe project it out a few years here. So we're waiting for them to address that and see them put that. And I think that's why Denon Marantz no longer advertises QMS. They probably never had it on those older units that claimed it, because the bug that's inherent in that Nuvoton chip. But they all support HDR and hybrid log gamma and HDR10 and HDR10 Plus, Dolby Vision, as we said before, and IMAX, and the HDCP copy protection 2.3. So they're all up to snuff. On the networking side, they all have Ethernet and wireless capabilities, as well as Bluetooth in and out. That old 8805 didn't have the Bluetooth out to an earphone or speaker, but every other unit has that. On the control side, they all support Alexa, Google, HomePod, not Josh AI anymore. They don't list that. Only the older models had that. Protocol integration with systems that can do controls through Ethernet, through infrared, in out, DB9 serial connections on an RS-232 connector. Triggers, the AV20 is 3 out versus the AV10 only gave you 2. I don't know why they couldn't put a 3rd trigger on the AV10, but I'm glad to see they've got it back up to 3 on the AV20, including now that 2 control outputs for if you have an AMP10 and AMP20. And then really good, stated support for all the major integration platforms. Ecosystems, they support AirPlay, AirPlay 2, it's Roon tested. Spotify, Inhouse, of course, is their own system. They don't support DTS Play-Fi. On internet streaming, all the normal suspects here, not MQA though, not YouTube Music or Indagio. Does support Qobuz, but here's the new thing. It supports Qobuz Connect, and this is a feature that was introduced back into, I think, every unit that Marantz supports Qobuz for. It's a direct way to connect to the Qobuz service versus streaming it from another utility on your phone or what have you. So Qobuz Connect, A lot of brands are supporting this. You can see at the bottom of the slide that Denon and Marantz are included in a pretty large list of, let's say, 10 plus manufacturers. Now, getting to the remotes, no big surprises here. It's using the same remote as everything else. There might be a subtle difference, but essentially the same unit with the backlight control on it. Although I do, even with the backlight, I do find it's hard to read. You kind of have to have muscle memory of where these buttons are on a lot of these remotes because the lettering is small. It's my general comment of not just Marantz, but a lot of different brands. The backlight only gets you so far. Physical dimensions. This is where we noted that you're 2 inches more shallow than an AV10 at 18 inches, 457 millimeters. That will help some. It weighs a little less than the AV10 at 33.1 pounds, 15 kilograms. Power consumption is 90 watts, just like the AV10, and standby of 0.2 watts. Now, these are made in Japan, as a lot of their premium products are. In fact, I think everything on the Cinema 40 up on this latest range is made in Japan. And they're giving you a 5-year warranty, which differs from Denon, which is only a 3-year warranty. And it differs from the older 8805 and 7706, were only 3 years. I started putting on here the summary on the side panels on the front being metallic versus plastic. That starts with the Cinema 30 on up. So this one does have metallic sides. It does have those front panel illuminations, which start at the Cinema 40 on up. And that has that enhanced copper shielding that started with the Cinema 30 on up. I'll talk a little bit about sound quality. And since I haven't brought these in, I can only speculate against the AV20 and the AV10 as potentially sounding better than the Cinema 30. Now, with all that extra cost you're paying, all that extra design, as you saw with the elevated capacitors and resistors and the HDMI boards and all that, it should sound better. How much better? Is it worth the price tag they're putting on? That's what we'd love to find out here. Is there a tier above that green circle that we show here? Then this could be, really, it would help justify the cost. I do still think they're a little on the pricey side. And with Emotiva coming now out with their RMC 1 Plus range, they may be going up because they're changing a lot of the components out as well. So it's going to be a race to the top on this and who can do it at a better price point. Just a few notes here along with the on-screen display that you do have support for the web interface to control this. You just put the IP address on there. So that was a very quick run through on a very capable unit, the AV20. What are your thoughts? Is this something you're considering? Now, $6,000 is an awful lot of money to spend. What would enable you to justify that extra cost over something, let's say, like the Cinema 30, which is $1,500 less? That feedback would be really useful to the Ripewave audio community. You think the value of going separates is going to take that sonically to a much better place? Or do you just go with the Cinema 30, get your amplifiers for free that you may or may not be using, and save the money to put on some other part of your system? So let me know your thoughts. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Be sure to hit that bell notification so you're informed when the next video is posted. Until the next time, keep evolving your audio experience.